Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Rice, the Development Coordinator here at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this very special panel we have today. I'm joined by Director of Advocacy Seth Stern and Asheville Blade guests David Forbes, Matilda Bliss, and Veronica Coit. Thank you all for joining us. This meeting is being recorded. I will cut the dead air at the start and clean it up a little bit and put it on the events archive for those that can't watch it. But the Q&A is open, so we're going to have a robust discussion and then open it up to some questions at the end of the hour. With that, I'll let you all introduce yourselves, and we can start with Seth.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. And thanks to all of our members who were able to join today. Thanks to all the people who might be able to watch us on YouTube or wherever it may be in the future. And to the members, really appreciate all you do to support our work. It's vital to everything we do, including the advocacy work that we're going to discuss today. And by the way, I didn't say my name. I'm Seth Stern. I'm the Director of Advocacy here at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. David, Matilda, Veronica, do you want to briefly introduce yourselves?
Certainly. I'm David Forbes. I'm the editor at the Asheville Blade, they pronouns. And so, yeah, thank you all for having us on and bringing attention to what our news cooperative is facing.
My name is Matilda Bliss. I'm a reporter with the Asheville Blade. Started in 2019. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Veronica, Coit, they, them, and I started with the Blade in 2020 in summer. And yeah, thank you for having us today.
And Veronica, I know you're on your way to an appointment, so appreciate your joining. I don't know whether you're going to be able to stay for the entire event.
I was able to switch it to actually earlier, so I'm all yours.
Great. That's great news that we've got everyone. So what we wanted to do today is talk a bit about the advocacy work we do at Freedom of the Press Foundation and use the example of the Asheville Blade journalists in their case of what we've done then to sort of showcase what we do on a local level and also call attention to the situation they're in and the threat to press freedom posed by their case, which we've been writing about extensively. Anyone who's been reading our newsletter has probably seen that. Unlike some organizations that focus solely on advocacy, we do a lot else besides advocacy. In fact, until this week, I was the only full-time advocate at the organization. We had our deputy director of advocacy, Caitlin Vogus, just joined us on Monday. Hopefully she is here. But the benefit of being at an organization where we do so much beyond advocacy is that we have so much institutional knowledge coming from everything from our digital security work for journalists to our US press freedom tracker, which monitors and documents press freedom violations across the country. And that's what really set the stage for the work we'll talk about today. When Matilda and Veronica were arrested on Christmas night of 2021, the tracker documented the arrests and had been in touch with them. So when I joined the foundation to direct the advocacy work in November, I had sort of firsthand access to all the background I needed to get involved in the advocacy work. And I'd note that, when Ryan asked me to highlight an example of our advocacy work today, we thought about focusing on some of our national campaigns on federal legislation. But the thing is that it's really only so often that there are opportunities to advance press freedom through federal legislation. Usually, if we're doing something in Washington, we're more focused on fighting back bad ideas than supporting good ones because they're kind of few and far between. But there are always going to be local journalists who we can help. Unfortunately, it's not likely that local police departments and prosecutors and other officials are going to stop harassing journalists whose reporting inconveniences them. And so, I'll tell you a little bit more, just recap, and Matilda and Veronica can tell their own story. But they were arrested on Christmas night 2021, as I said, in Asheville. They were there to cover an eviction of a homeless encampment at a public park. The charges they're facing are based solely on their staying at the park after its closing time to document what police were doing. After I don't know how many continuances, They were tried at a bench trial in April and convicted of trespassing. Under North Carolina law, though, they get a second trial, this time in front of a jury. That's scheduled for June 12th. The reason that this case really caught our attention, one, what I just said, that it's so rare that journalists are prosecuted, well, just generally, but especially without any allegation that they caused any harm. This is really just a technicality, gotcha, you were here after 10, as opposed to, say, obstructing police or disorderly conduct. Usually there's at least some pretext beyond just a trespass. Also, though, this is only the fourth time since 2018, according to the tracker, that journalists have been tried for after being arrested in the course of news gathering. Usually authorities quickly drop charges once they kind of realize what a bad look it is for them, frankly, to devote public resources to criminalizing journalism. So we've been doing everything we can to try to call attention to this case and get authorities to drop the charges. Realistically, it's tough to say whether that'll happen. They seem pretty committed to going forward, but at least next time some other prosecutor thinks of pursuing a case like this, they'll see that they won't be able to do it quietly. There are advocates out there who are going to make a scene and they're in for a fight. So anyway, Matilda and David, thanks again for taking the time to talk to us. Maybe we can start by Matilda, from your perspective, taking us back to Christmas night in 2021 and telling us what happened. And Veronica, feel free to chime in as well. I didn't realize you were going to be here today.
Sure. Thanks, Seth. So giving some context for that week, there had been other events that week. Art parties, people were coming into the park to make art. The first night of that, on December 19th, 2021, people tried to, there were people that were camping in the park. And those types of events where there's camps in the park are, according to Asheville Police standard operating procedure of the time, they were supposed to be given 7 days. And the police told people that they were in the process of changing that policy and that they were going to operate basically on a different policy that was actually not in their manual. This was something that other media had covered during the week, including mainstream outlets. And we were there every night, to our knowledge, that something happened. It was started Sunday. It was Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. On Wednesday, we actually reported on a police commander telling people who had brought up art supplies into the park. The police commander had told those people that they needed to leave. This was during daylight hours. So we reported on that. We named that commander. Then that led up to Christmas. We followed a lead. Reporters get leads. And we were there starting in the afternoon. And it was a very calm atmosphere, I would say. There were people sharing food. There was people playing music, talking with each other. There were even people in a public housing tower that were yelling their appreciation for us. Or not, I wouldn't say us, but the people that were in the park. That was it. There was not really anything that could be called not Christmas like going on there. So we were there covering that. There were tents set up. It got to be evening time, and I actually, so to be clear, there has been no conversation by police at all. It gets to be around 9 p.m. and we all have second jobs. I needed to attend to a corgi across town and put that dog to bed. So I went away for a little bit. when I came back, the police were surrounding, or they were a lot of police cars were arriving, and they were talking with each other, and then they started making their way up the hill. And Veronica, do you want to talk about when you arrived that night?
Yeah, thank you, Matilda. So I got there, I guess, a little bit before 10. It was Christmas, and I had been with my family the whole day, and I wanted to bring Matilda a plate of dinner. And I got there with my best friend and my son, and we looked down the hill, and just all of a sudden there was like 10 cop cars, and I knew there were at least one, if not two, in there, and I knew that I couldn't leave Matilda alone. So I gave my friend the keys and asked for a jacket from the car and stayed with Matilda to cover her. I just remember being in shock. I was like, it's Christmas. Like, I know they're short staffed. I know they would rather be home with their families. Why do this tonight?
Yeah.
But they were there, so I stayed.
And just a reminder that one of the key things that we were watching was the 7-day standard operating procedure, which at the time governed police eviction of homeless camps, which there were people there that were very clearly homeless. They had nowhere else to go. And I know we'll get to the arrest in a little bit. I don't want to jump too much into that, but there was obviously like news happening in the park. Like, are they going to honor this operating procedure that they've that is on the books for them?
And we can go ahead and talk about the arrests as well, if you can just sort of recap how that situation developed. And by the way, I'm going to, as we talk, drop links into the chat to some of what we've written and done on this case. I just put in the links to the Press Freedom Trackers write-ups of both Matilda and Veronica's arrest, so you can just get a sense of what that looks like. But go ahead, Matilda or Veronica,
Sure.
and just talk about the arrests and that the confrontation with police and how that played out.
Okay. Yeah, we were both told by the first wave of cops to come up the hill that we were trespassing. I was clearly displaying my press credentials. Veronica was reminding them several times of their press credentials. Yeah, so I'd say about 25 minutes pass, and we're told several times we become the only people up there who are still recording. It was actually shown in the body cam footage later on that the police were offended that we were videotaping, and that there was a explicit comment about getting the standing ones first because they're videotaping. So we're, recording, taking pictures, video and audio recording. So there's definitely limitations on where we can be in the park. Aston Park is on top of a hill, in a pretty large park. It's one of the largest parks in Asheville, in the Asheville park system. And this is on a hill. It's at nighttime, obviously. And there was really nowhere else that we could do our news coverage. We were being told to go down to the sidewalk outside the park to be able to continue news gathering, which would have just been impossible. And so Veronica, do you want to talk about when they arrested you?
Yeah, I remember like a couple minutes before they actually arrested us. We were standing close to each other, and I told you that I had heard one of them say they're recording and kind of gesturing towards us. And when the one had said that to the other cop, they like turned around away from us, and I thought that was really interesting. And then, yeah, I mean, we stayed out of the way. We just needed to be there to witness what was happening. And then before I knew it, I was being put in handcuffs and being led out of the park for trespassing. even after so many times we've talked about it, I still just, I can't believe it actually happened. Like, it seemed so straightforward. If they left, we would have had no news to catch. So we would have also been able to leave.
Yeah,
yeah.
and when so I actually heard Veronica say, "Are you serious?" Like, I heard that across the park because we were in different we were capturing from different angles, and I was like, "Oh wow, what is going on?" And so, you know, it's one thing to be arresting people who are in tents in a park. It's another thing for them to be arresting press. So I especially wanted to get some pictures or video of them arresting Veronica. And at that time, I was asked by the commander over the eviction if I was leaving the park. And I was like, I have a First Amendment right to be here. I'm clearly marked press. And they didn't care, which they actually testified at the trial. And they arrested me too, and put us both in the police wagon. The one of the officers thinks about putting me in the correct gendered side, the female side, and he reconsiders. And he had some of the most transphobic things to say after I was arrested, as captured on the body cam footage, including continuing to just be in total disbelief that my name was Matilda. And he could have very easily looked at my driver's license to see the F designating female, but that was not something that he cared about either.
Asheville cops are incredibly bigoted, even by cop standards.
But so then Veronica, you actually are one of the first that are processed, and you had an interesting interaction with the magistrate.
Oh yeah, that one's always one I think about every time we talk about this too. I was one of the first two people brought in to be processed and released. And I remember the cop that had my paperwork looking at the magistrate and saying, they said they were press, or they talking about me and Matilda. And the magistrate just said, well, are they real press? And the cop just shook his head. Because the magistrate could have chosen in that moment to say, I'm not actually going to take these charges. You need to release those two. But no, that wasn't his concern. His concern was, are they, real press? By whatever it is, whatever criteria they use to define what is real.
And then I'm actually taken out of the police vehicle last after 2.5 hours of being in there. At this point, my whole body hurts. I'm 6 foot tall. I'm cramped in the back of a police wagon. My legs are hurting. My back is hurting. My shoulders are hurting. I have red marks on my wrist afterwards from the handcuffs pressing in. And I am, I was arrested second. I was processed last. Yeah, that was what happened on Christmas of 2021.
Thanks for sharing that, and we'll unpack some of that a little bit more. One point I wanted to follow up on, which has already been mentioned, is that the Asheville Blade isn't a conventional newspaper. It's proudly leftist. It's vocally adversarial to the police department. David, I was wondering if, as the founder of the Blade, you can talk more about how you think that plays into the way Matilda and Veronica were treated, as opposed to how they might have been treated had they worked for, I don't know, the Washington Post or even the Asheville Citizen Times.
I think it plays into it highly. I've been a journalist in Asheville since 2005. I've worked for a variety of different publications before founding the Blade. I have never seen, no other publication in town gets treated like this. The only other time in the entire time in Asheville, it's nearly 20 years now, that a journalist was ever arrested, they were quickly released and the charges were dropped within, I think, like 72 hours. On the contrary, as a kind of counterexample, not only has this happened, in 2020, Veronica was pulled out of their vehicle while covering a protest going on kind of that summer when the uprising was happening, and arrested then. It took over a year to drop the charges. We are the only publication in town that gets targeted like this. And it does not exactly take a rocket scientist to see the correlation with the fact that we're also one of the only publications to be openly critical of city government, these institutions, not just, for some of the more egregious corruptions, but also for just how they operate and the misery they inflict day to day. There is a long history in Asheville. It's supposedly a tourist town of the press being viewed basically as adjuncts to those in power. You're supposed to make the town look good for tourism. I've literally heard city officials, even though they're supposedly a progressive town at this point in its history, say, oh, they want the press to work with them, which in my, even before I was kind of a radical, I never thought was the point of the press. You are supposed to ask questions. You are supposed to seek out hard truths. As I put it kind of early in my career, based on something a mentor had told me, if you walk into a city council chamber, any government chamber of people you're covering, and the politicians there don't curse, you're not doing your job right. That is a very basic fact. You are supposed to be a check on them. And as time has gone on, this city is one of the least affordable in the country. There are a lot of injustices. I've lived in the South my whole life. Asheville was by far the most segregated town I've ever seen. I think as journalists, period, but especially as journalists, who deeply believe in social justice, we're called to kind of act on that and criticize it and not just say, hey, this is happening, but here's some conclusions based on it. It absolutely plays a role in us being persecuted like this. I mean, you said it yourself. It is incredibly rare to see prosecutors and city governments go after journalists like this. And I think that is both, while there are certainly national issues with press being targeted more, I think this also has to do with the specific city and how unused the establishment here is to adversarial radical press that does its job, basically, and doesn't back down.
Yeah, and it's a point that we've been trying to make all along. One, people should value small media outlets, independent media outlets, alternative media outlets, journalists who provide a different approach than sort of the down the middle objectivity that's become the common objective of many larger media outlets. That's valuable and worth protecting on its own. And the other point that we've tried to make is that if this case sets a precedent in North Carolina, which might lead to dominoes falling elsewhere, that journalists can be convicted for covering news happening at a public park simply because it's nighttime. That precedent is not going to be limited to the Asheville Blade or to Matilda and Veronica. Any journalist, no matter how mainstream, big or small the outlet, is going to be bound by that precedent. And we're hoping that people can appreciate that and sort of, even if they don't like the Asheville Blade, even if they don't like you for whatever reason, get behind that principle because it's there for everybody. One other point I wanted to follow up on that I think Matilda, or maybe it was Veronica, mentioned, and which we also made in the op-ed that I dropped into the chat, is that, what were you supposed to do in this situation? Do the police expect the press to just ignore news happening in plain sight because it's nighttime? That seems absurd. Matilda and Veronica, can you talk about why you made the decision to not stop recording and not leave when the cops told you to, and why it's important in your view that other journalists have the right to do that in similar situations?
Yeah, I mean, you go ahead.
No, you go first.
Oh, okay. So, there was not really any other way that we could have continued news gathering. It's a very large park and it's on a hill. We were being instructed to go to a place where we couldn't have captured what was happening. That is news. It's obvious it's news that people being evicted from tents on Christmas, like unhoused people being told to leave the park like on Christmas. I think there wasn't a story about a family trying to find room in the inn, anyway, so and then in addition to how Asheville Police was treating its own standard operating procedure, That was something that it had talked about in the media before. Literally the same, there was a camp at the same park 8 months before in Aston Park. There was a camp that was evicted, and it had reached its 7 days. It was on that 7th day. It was in the daytime, so that itself was pretty suspect. But like that was something that Asheville Police had operated on that same year. It was obviously news, and we were there to gather news. We were identifying as such, and we were removed before they could drag people from tents. That was, we feel, exactly why they removed us, especially with other people having left the area who could have recorded that act. There was nobody to record that. It's no mistake that there is no record outside the body camera footage of those people getting removed from town.
I think it's also worth noting here real quick, we don't have to guess about the Asheville Police's attitude towards media, even beyond the body cam scenes, beyond the fact of their actions. In 2020, there was a department-wide survey, and the top conclusions from about their priorities, how APD officers define safety, included, and I quote, no scrutiny from media, and quote, knowing your decisions will not be scrutinized. This is their attitudes towards the press, towards any sort of scrutiny they don't like and don't control, are very clear, and their actions follow from that.
What she said. Veronica, do you have any?
Yeah, I do have something to add. I feel the same way about this arrest that I did when I returned back out when I got arrested in 2020, which was, this is witnessing and bringing the information to the broader public who can't be everywhere all the time. Not that we could either, but it was important to stay and to witness and to take that risk into consideration. And for me, the witnessing and sharing the information always outweighs the risk.
Which when you were arrested earlier that year, or actually the previous year in 2020, there was video of you getting arrested. And that was part of raising that awareness to finally get those charges dropped.
So sort of relatedly, and you're talking about this being an ongoing issue in Asheville, but in addition to the First Amendment, which is at play here for obvious reasons, you also have a Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial, and that did not happen here. The trial was continued over and over again, and that was just sort of trial 1 out of 2. It's been well over a year and a half, I think, that you've been awaiting the outcome of these misdemeanor charges. Can you talk about what that's been like for you and for the Asheville Blade, emotionally, economically, in terms of the Blade's ability and your ability to do the kind of journalism you want to be doing with this hanging over your head?
Yeah, it's been extremely exhausting. And you know, having to clear out space in our schedules, you know, every couple months at, you know, the whole last year and a half to you know, maybe not be in the courtroom, but be ready to be in case the prosecutor wants us there, you know, like, so and then of course with them confiscating my phone, trying to coordinate with my lawyer around getting that back, that also took 2.5 months. So yeah, I think it's, you know, we were ready to go to trial in November. There was illness on both sides of the case. We were ready to go to trial in January, and the prosecutor tried to lump us in with a protesters case, which our lawyer was able to get quashed. Thankfully, it was just ridiculous. Yeah, so then we had, of course, finally had our bench trial in April, and I don't know if you want to go into that immediately, but you know, of course, we were convicted. We drew a judge who had said that he thought that defunding the police was the craziest thing he had heard in an interview with a media outlet earlier that year. Yeah, we were we did not draw a favorable judge, and now we're getting ready for a jury trial, which could, you know, having to clear out, you know, potentially 2 weeks of our lives to, you know, potentially be in that courtroom while proceedings go. You know, like, it's very possible they could do that to us.
And I can also speak on the wider level as a cooperative. You know, we're a small organization. All of us are working class, trans, and non-binary people. We all have other work we have to do to stay afloat in, you know, one of the most expensive, or one of the least affordable cities in the U.S. You know, we definitely, that kind of fuels our journalism, but also poses some very real challenges. You know, during the bench trial, half of our cooperative had to be in the courtroom. And then, as you know, the one remaining reporter in Asheville, I had to go be in that courtroom as well. Matilda had to stop covering another trial that was going on of some of the activists who were arrested both at Aston Park and the aftermath, which is also a very important trial, targeted federally littering charges for having like art supplies and mutual aid supplies in a public park, which is also very worrying on First Amendment and other grounds. But you know, Matilda had to stop in the middle of covering that trial, and we couldn't have anyone else there because to be there as well. You know, we are while we have a lot of community support and we're very thankful for it, we operate in a shoestring budget. This has been very challenging from that perspective as far as financially. We're committed to fighting this out. At the same time, it's not coincidence that even if, you know, all this gets dropped or a jury, you know, takes 5 minutes and finds not guilty, smaller publications like ours, which are, you know, kind of the bedrock of independent journalism, have a real hard time just fighting this kind of process, when this kind of intimidation effort, when the other side is, you know, the state, city hall, who have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal and, you know, lots and lots of time and resources.
Understood. That makes perfect sense that you were taken away from covering the felony littering trial, which, as you said, is also really newsworthy. Yeah, I hadn't realized that, but of course, a small news organization can only be in so many places at once. You've mentioned the body cam footage, so I wanted to go back to that. And I dropped a link to it in the chat, but Ryan, I think my links are only going to the hosts and panelists. So if you could send that in again so that everyone can see it. That is the petition that we filed along with the ACLU of North Carolina to get the body cam footage released. It came to our attention in the course of talking to Matilda and Veronica that there is a really bizarre North Carolina law, I think one of the strictest body cam laws in the country, that essentially requires people who want to view body cam footage to get it released to the public to file a lawsuit to get access. So we did that, not knowing what the body cam footage was going to show or whether it would even be significant, but knowing that it should be out there for the sake of transparency, because arrests of journalists are newsworthy, as is everything else that happened in the park that night. So we filed that petition. It was successful. The body cam footage was released on YouTube. David, as someone who wasn't there to see what happened firsthand, can you talk about the significance of that footage being released publicly, and also your takeaways from actually being able to see what happened to the journalists who work for your co-op?
Certainly. So I think I'll start with a good way to summarize it is watching the footage, and with the help of Matilda and some other folks in our wider community, we went through every single hour of it, every single minute for our reporting. We did a large piece called What the Camera Showed on our site, which I welcome people to check out. I think it shines a lot of light on what's going on here. I think the easiest way to summarize is I was shocked but not surprised. I think one of the things that really surprised was how, or not surprised, but was how blatant the APD was. They were literally pointing at Veronica and Matilda and being like, you know, well, we should arrest them first because they're videotaping. After Veronica was arrested, a reporter, a cop pointed at Matilda and was like, well, here's the other reporter, maybe this person will wise up, kind of a blatant intimidation. So I think to say that the footage was damning, I think would be an understatement. As someone else who's involved in press freedom stuff said when they looked at some of the early stuff from it, they're like, this is not a smoking gun, it's a smoking arsenal. The police openly disregard basic press rights. They don't even say, hey, you step back there. They're just like, leave the park entirely. They are openly bigoted towards Matilda as a trans woman. I think the significance is this is how police operate in the ground. And at one point, they discuss charges they could arrest protesters who had stepped back, who had followed the order to step back to the edge of the park. What they could arrest them for, making up things like, oh, well, maybe one of them threw something at me, or one of them, is getting disorderly, or literally running down charges. And as journalists who've been very critical of the police, who are in fact, abolitionists, this is kind of like, okay, well, this is how they operate. And you mentioned the very stringent law in North Carolina. Part of it is meant to hide things like this, not just some of the more blatant instances of, brutality, as awful as that is, but this very day-to-day level of corruption, of, completely ignoring any rights people may have, of not wanting any scrutiny. And I think that definitely kind of came through loud and clear in that body cam footage. I admit it was difficult to watch. I have a lot of experience, delving into this kind of stuff, reporting on instances of, injustice and brutality, sadly, including a lot of police brutality. But even still, watching this was hard to watch. Matilda and Veronica are not just my colleagues and my coworkers, they're my friends. So seeing this kind of like, over and over again, going through this footage, having to get it right, having to analyze what happened, it's difficult to happen. I don't think that's always gets talked about either, is that, sometimes our profession takes a toll on us. Even the journalists who weren't in the park that night still have to deal with exhaustion, still have to deal with seeing things that are awful over and over again. And so I think I think it's everyone should, if you're interested in press freedom, regardless of where you live, you should, look at some of our coverage, look at some of the work y'all have done around this. I think the help from y'all, from the ACLU, from the community journalists was invaluable. I think that has been a huge factor in this, is that I think the local powers that be just thought that they could roll over the small organization, and the solidarity from larger press freedom groups I think has meant a lot, because if you mentioned earlier, if they can do this, they're going to do it to other journalists as well. And indeed, we're already seeing the APD's supporters, who are largely the local far right, the same criticisms they've lobbed at us, about not being real journalists, and so thus it's okay to arrest them, what have you. Now, because when recently some establishment press here even reported on some things that were kind of negative to the police department about a really ugly incident of police brutality that happened and was caught on video, they're using the exact same rationales against them. Oh, well, you're writing things that aren't fair to the police, so you're not a real journalist anymore. But the implication, you can be charged or arrested or what have you. City managers outright said that she, as his police chief, that nothing, they don't see any problem with anything that happened in that footage. She said she thinks the police have a right to determine who doesn't count as a journalist. Whether you're in Asheville or Portland or anywhere in between, or 1,000 other places, you should find what's happening in this town very chilling.
You mentioned a couple of the other organizations that have gotten involved, and I just dropped a link into the chat. Ryan, if you could send that again, to the coalition letter from, I think, 47 organizations nationwide, which we sort of spearheaded along with the CPJ, calling for these charges to be dropped. So far, they, of course, haven't been, but it was, I was pleasantly surprised by how much interest the case began to generate, at least from press freedom and civil liberties organizations. It hasn't, however, generated the same interest from the national press. You'll see instances where a journalist from a national paper is arrested, not tried, just arrested, even just detained. And it's not front page news, but it's national news. How important is it that cases like yours get that kind of attention, regardless of whether your publication has the same name recognition as another might?
I think it's incredibly important. I think I mentioned before, organizations like ours, whether people agree with all our stances or not, are, if a press should exist and matter, local organizations, independent local organizations, are kind of the bedrock of that. And this is where press freedom really matters, because usually it's not the organizations that have connection, have some favorable, some politicians like them or give them access, or that have, millions of dollars in their budget, that really need those protections. It is the organizations on the ground, that are some local folks, with support from local readers, local donors mostly, that are trying to tell the truth about what they see and do some solid investigation. So I think that it is important to get national attention. Also, I think as it has gotten more attention, it does put some real pressure. We thank y'all for, and those the many other organizations. It was really wonderful to see that level of solidarity between all these different organizations with different viewpoints, different perspectives on journalism. In some cases, just all say, no, this is wrong and it has to stop. But I do think, I think to some degree, maybe journalists and editors, especially editors and management, this is just something happening, with those radical fringe journalists. Absolutely not. Like,
David, I think you may have frozen. I'm not sure if I'm the only one having that issue.
Nope, I can confirm that, Seth.
Okay. Well, while we try to sort out the connectivity issues, I will sort of set up where we might go from here. And maybe Veronica can talk to some of these points. So a couple newer pieces of information we've gotten about this case. One, that Matilda's phone was, we knew it was seized, but we did not know that a warrant was issued to search the phone for evidence of alleged crimes by protesters at the site where Matilda was reporting. Now that violates federal law, and in our view is a pretty big deal. The Press Freedom Tracker tracks seizures of equipment from journalists in addition to arrests of journalists, assaults of journalists, because there are any number of ways to retaliate against the press and inhibit the press, and that's one of them. Another thing we learned, and Veronica, maybe you can talk about this one, is that the Asheville Blade journalists, Matilda and Veronica, were actually banned from Asheville city parks for a year. That does not fit neatly into any of the Press Freedom Tracker categories, not because it's not important, but because who would have ever thought that would happen? Veronica, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I found out through records requests that the defendants of the felony littering had gotten a hold of, and it just got sent to me by a friend, and did you know you were banned from all city parks for a year? And I had, like, who would have thought? It was so, I sent it to Matilda right away, like, did you know about this? None of us had known about it at all. And it was just the strangest thing. No letter, no email, no phone call, no contact whatsoever. And I walk in parks all over the city, like, every day. I had no idea. And, like, if the right set of circumstances, I could have been arrested and had no idea why. Yeah.
Same. Like, the Asheville Police Department had actually sent me mail saying that I could pick up my phone when the district attorney finally decided that she would release it, and not even mentioned in that letter that, oh, by the way, you're banned from all Asheville parks for a year. Like, they had plenty of opportunity to mention that, and they didn't. And that also could have been arrested, whether it be hanging out with friends or family, or doing my other job, which was taking care of animals and sometimes walking them in the park. I could have been arrested on trespassing charges and that animal be taken to the animal shelter. You never know. I mean,
it's also worth noting, Veronica and Matilda were banned based on one officer's say so. So there was, secretly, there was never any notice. You have to, while generally we cover city government meetings remotely due to COVID risk, you have to walk through parks that they would be banned from if they were going to cover a meeting in person. And on top of that, the reason for the ban was supposedly camping in a public park, which the police in the state never even accused them of. So like there is a certain level of just like absurdity to all this, but it's no less dangerous for being that absurd.
Yeah, and I suspect, although who knows, that the reason you didn't get notice of the ban was incompetence as opposed to an intentional failure to provide notice. But it's possible it was intentional. And, either way, if that had been public, if the national press had known about that, if lawyers around the country had known about that at the time, before, by the time it came out, the ban was already over. So it was sort of moot. You weren't banned anymore. But that, I think, whether you're the Asheville Blade, whatever journalism organization you are, that would have created a major story. The idea that journalists are being barred from city parks where they gather news, for gathering news at city parks for an entire year, really unheard of. It's sort of unfortunate that news didn't come to light earlier. Matilda, can you talk a bit more about what happened with your phone? We touched on it a bit while you were getting back online, but sure. That's sort of a developing story. I think you just got a copy of the warrant this week.
Yeah, so finally got a copy of the warrant, and I guess the prosecutor's office said that it was in the public file all along. I have doubts about that. Anyway, we get this warrant, and it's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with either of us until they get to the very final paragraph, and they're talking about at the time I operated a social justice events page, and would include it could itself be called a media outlet because I included links to news and I commented on that news, and I also made income from this calendar through a pretty common site. It's actually the same site that the Blade uses to
Patreon. Yeah.
Patreon. So this site, this news calendar, and it also included mutual aid opportunities, people who needed like emergency health care, needed help with moving, or various life happenings that usually face too much poverty to address. And anyway, the fact that this talked about the events at Aston, and I was expressing sympathy with them. Again, as a person, even if I was the Blade account talking about that would not be illegal. There's nothing against individuals or journalists even like talking about like sympathy with various causes. And I still don't know how they were trying to say that I had prior knowledge of things that happened there, drawing from this events calendar. But anyway, that's what they said, that there was extensive links to anarchist extremists, which like there was definitely anarchist stuff in there, but like literally like mainstream social media outlets, like the algorithm sending me various anarchist happenings and me copying and pasting those links. It boggles my mind that they could consider that to be enough to get into my phone. But that's what they at least tried to do. There's a lot of questions on whether or not they got in, but
I think it's worth noting this is explicitly targeting a journalist for her political views.
Yeah.
There is nothing illegal about a journalist expressing sympathy for a cause. Nothing illegal about journalists sharing a public, a link to a public social media post about an event or a protest that's going on. And there's nothing legal about a journalist or anyone else being an anarchist. And definitely, I think this is an example of, you mentioned that the search warrant itself breaks federal law. But this is an extra level. This is explicitly targeting certain journalists for their viewpoints, and just straight up saying like, hey, we don't like this person's views, and a magistrate going, okay, search their phone. And everyone should find that.
And it didn't even mention that I was arrested as press. There's no mention at all that I was press, and that's why I was in the park.
And that's another. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you're going to complete my thought. Go ahead.
That's another instance where we don't really know if it's incompetence or malice behind that omission. But by not mentioning that you were press, they were able to conceal from the judge who issued the warrant the violation of the Privacy Protection Act of 1980, which prohibits searches of journalists' files for evidence of essentially alleged crimes that the journalists witnessed in the course of news gathering. The judge shouldn't have issued the warrant for all the reasons you all just said, that it targeted you based on your political views. But putting that aside, the judge would have had no way of knowing that issuing the warrant violates the PPA, because the warrant, either intentionally or accidentally, who knows, failed to mention that you're journalists at all. Going along with the theme you've mentioned throughout this entire ordeal of people doubting your status as journalists, even though you literally go to newsworthy events and document them, merely because the blade is small, the blade is leftist, whatever the blade may be. But there's no definition of journalist that I'm aware of under which you don't qualify. Anyway, we're short on time, so let's open it up to some questions from some of the people who have been kind enough to attend today. Ryan, if you want to relay those questions to the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 4 questions and a hand raise, so I'll try and answer them in order, and then maybe get one of my own questions in at the end. The first one is, has the LGBT community offered support, and has the transphobic statements been documented? They're wondering if previous cases reveal a lesser sentence for journalists in this jurisdiction, if there's any bias there.
I can say that the larger queer and trans community has been immensely supportive. And this is kind of, I think, gets something Asheville too. However, a lot of the kind of establishment organizations here are sometimes organizations we criticized for, their coziness with larger corporations. One of them is run by a county commissioner who's taken some very controversial votes, to give millions of dollars incentives to a weapons company, for example. Those organizations have been pretty silent. I think that's also kind of dangerous, because whether you agree with the viewpoints that, a queer or trans person has, I think anyone can agree the kind of bigotry Matilda was faced with, which we document extensively in our What the Cameras Showed article. We also had posts on our site documenting extensively. It's out there, and body cam footage is out on YouTube. You can see an officer repeatedly misgendering her, repeatedly mistreating her. Journalists, as I think I mentioned, have not faced sentences in Asheville for this in memory. Basically, we did some digging and couldn't find any similar cases. And the one time a journalist was arrested in all the years I've been here, the charges were dropped within, I think, like 2 to 3 days. It was, I think, like once the DA came back from over the weekend, because it happened like late in a Friday afternoon, the charges were immediately dropped.
And made public statements about why.
Yeah, and made public statements about, the freedom of the press is important. Same district attorney, by the way. So yeah, that's kind of where things are. But the Blades always rely on community support. We're not, if organizations, especially some organizations like y'all's that do amazing work, do choose to, support what we're doing and help stand for our rights, great. But at a local level, we rely on community support, folks on the ground.
Yeah, and I think it's noteworthy that we're, like, I don't know, are there instances of, like, is that something that comes up in these trials, that where these journalists are like taken to trial or convicted and like claimed to not be journalists, and that's the basis. I find that really interesting that we're trans and non-binary, and we're the ones that are getting this type of smearing, that's too much of a coincidence.
There's definitely bigotry going on in this at multiple levels.
Next question is from Sally. So scary and threatening to our democracy. Do you have any legal help from the ACLU? How are you paying for your legal expenses? I know Seth mentioned the ACLU was part of the org that signed on in your defense, but this question is specifically for the legal help and expenses.
So the ACLU was helpful with the body cam footage. The attorney defending Veronica Matilda has been working pro bono for the time being. The same time, our organization has suffered some pretty serious financial strain for all the issues we just mentioned. We have to drop what we're doing. We have to drop reaching out to subscribers, holding fundraisers, things like that, to go, either cover or help our journalists, in court. So it is a real strain for a small organization like ours.
Yeah, and we were possibly going to be it's still not a sure thing. We won't be included in the lawsuit opposing the park bans the ACLU is pressing, but at this time we are not part of that, probably on the basis of our bans expiring before the lawsuit was pressed. But we are in communication with the person who is leading that lawsuit on behalf of the ACLU, and the best thing we can say at this point is stay tuned as far as other things regarding the ACLU. But we have an excellent pro bono attorney, and he's working with a lot of folks to help us defeat this.
Pro bono is good to hear. Next question from Jennifer. Thank you to the panelists. Can you provide any advice to fellow reporters about getting arrested? Were you scared, physically threatened? Who did you call? Overnight in jail? PTSD? We hear about reporter arrests and it seems distressing. Thank you for your courage.
I wanted to speak on this because I've been arrested twice since working with the Blade. And it wasn't until doing a lot of therapy that I was able to recognize, like, when they talk about the footage that's been gone over, I didn't watch the footage. I won't watch the footage. My stepfather was a cop and he was incredibly abusive, and he used the moving the arm behind your back, and he put his 6'5", 275-pound me on my back when I was 13. So this is a lot, and therapy is wonderful, and the support when we had our most recent bench trial, we knew that they were going to play some of the footage from the arrest to some extent. Thankfully, they didn't put it on the big screen, but Matilda was incredibly supportive, and I was so grateful to have her by my side. Sorry, there's a lot. So yeah, it's traumatic, no matter if you have my experience or not. It's awful to be ripped out of your car or from just doing what you're doing, and you're not causing anybody any harm, and the next thing you know, you're being forcibly shoved into a car. It's a lot. And I wouldn't change any of it, though. For all of it, I wouldn't change any of it. I still would have stayed. I still would have gone back out because I believe in this stuff. I believe in the press freedom, and I believe in advocating for people that are historically marginalized and swept aside. I was told about the body cam footage that one of the striking things was how the cops were in disbelief that anyone would even care about what was happening to homeless people, because they're people. They're just other people. And that's why I stayed.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. It's huge to know that you're still fighting this, and just despite everything you've been through, continuing to fight with me and us. Yeah, I've had last year was probably the biggest year as far as health expenses go for me, one of the biggest things, but I developed a teeth grinding habit, which just like, what? How did this happen? It's been incredibly stressful. Was already trying to reduce my scroll time, and with this happening, it just like boggled my mind that like another day would go by that this was not dismissed, because it's just so outrageously wrong. And it, yeah, just being dragged in front of the judge, it's incredibly stressful. I don't know how much of my life has been taken in the last year and a half because of just the sheer amount of stress. So, you know, it still absolutely going to keep fighting this, but it is, and then anticipating, you know, potentially 2 weeks of having to be in that courtroom for pretrial and then the trial itself. That is that's stressful, very stressful, and I have to plan my whole life around something. Like we both do have to plan our whole lives around making sure we can be in that room and being composed in a situation that is incredibly scary and you know, infuriating. It's just a huge mess of a situation that we have to endure because the police don't like us.
I do think one thing that helped the night of is that after Veronica's 2020 arrest, especially we knew this was a real possibility. As journalists who are very critical of the police, we know that police disregard all kinds of, even the protections that are there on paper, they disregard those at the time. They are by nature an arbitrary, violent institution. And so we had a kind of a setup where while they were on the ground, I was like aware of what was going on. So like as soon as the word came out that like Veronica and Matilda had been arrested, I was like heading down to the jail, ready to support them, ready to press the magistrate for their release, ready to like bail them out if it came to that. Fortunately, no bond was set. But like, I think especially as harassment of the press escalates, because it's certainly gone off of their journalists too, and I think it's going to, as kind of the aversion of people in power and politicians in power to any press with teeth kind of escalates. I think publications need to have someone like that, whatever structure they use, have someone who's in contact with the folks on the ground, who's there for support. And if something happens, is ready to make a beeline for the jail and support them and get them out of there as fast as possible. This is going to happen again. It is happening again to people all around the country.
I appreciate that. Last question in text, and then I'll shoot it over to Bevan, who's got their hand raised. This question kind of ties into a question I had, so I'll read it and then I'll follow up with my thoughts. What is FPF doing to create a dialogue between police departments and journalists? I'm a former journalist and my friend is a commander of a police department and he's leading anti-bias classes all over the nation. I wonder if there's something similar that could be done, but on journalism. And my question was, I know FPF has the widest definition of journalist possible, and that's a great thing. And these cops asked, are you even a real journalist? I've heard police officers ask that before at protests. So they're trying to narrow the definition of what a journalist is, and FPF is trying to widen it, right? So is there anything being done like that, Seth?
On our end, in terms of working with police departments, that's not something we're doing at the moment. If we were to find a particular police department or an avenue where we thought that had a good chance of being, productive, I would be open to that possibility. But the thing is, like when you watch the body cam footage here where people are saying arrest them first because they're recording, I don't know that is the avenue by which we can affect change. I'm not saying no police reform is at all effective, but one avenue that I think is maybe more effective than that, at least from my perspective, and I'm willing to be persuaded on this, is approaching the judiciary and attempting to educate judges on the First Amendment, because judges might go their whole career and only hear one case involving journalists and involving these kinds of press freedom issues. And the thing with judges is they don't want to be reversed. So whether they're acting in good faith, acting in bad faith, whether you like them, whether they're the right judge for the case, what they all have in common is they don't want to be reversed. So when you can explain the protections that the law already provides to judges, they're going to, in most cases, want to rule correctly, because they might be looking to get to the appellate court. They might be looking for a favorable transfer or promotion. They don't want to be reversed. So they, that to me seems like a productive avenue, and a good judge can at least mitigate the harm done by a bad cop. If this judge had known about the the federal law against issuing these kinds of warrants, maybe the warrant wouldn't have been issued. If the judge in the bench trial was more aware of the protections afforded to journalists against retaliatory arrests, maybe he wouldn't have viewed this as solely a trespassing case. So that's where I think we can hopefully make a difference. And part of that is, as you point out, Ryan, educating judges on what it means to be a journalist, that journalists are not just, New York Times reporters, and that even non-journalists are afforded protection when engaged in acts of journalism. You might not be a journalist for a day, but you can engage in an act of journalism. And the First Amendment is not limited to professional journalists, which hardly existed at the time of the First Amendment, at least in the way we think of it now. So there's plenty of room to educate the judiciary. In terms of educating police departments, I think that's something you kind of need to look at department by department and really get a sense of whether there is a good faith interest in being educated before devoting resources to providing that education. At least that's my view on it. And again, if there are efforts ongoing that I'm not aware of, if people feel differently, if any of our members, think that there's an avenue we should be pursuing, please reach out. I'm all ears. I'm willing to be persuaded on that point.
Honestly, I think something that really is helpful is that FPF has done, and organizations have fortunately joined in, is the kind of widespread backlash we're seeing. And even if it doesn't immediately result in these charges being dismissed, I guarantee you it's made, that sort of response, that sort of very quick response, in the case of y'all's organization, it increases the public cost for police doing things like this. And from nearly, if there by time covering, police departments in college, investigating them there, like over 20 years investigating police departments on the ground, seeing how hostile they are to scrutiny, that possibility is a lot more likely to stay their hand from arresting journalists or carrying out, some violation of press freedoms than is, I think, more training education. A lot of, we've seen cops on the body camera footage talking blatantly about ignoring all kinds of freedoms. Now the possibility of consequence, possibility of bad press, the possibility of their higher ups, getting flack for it, that tends to actually put some hesitation in there. And so that's where, if there's going to be kind of a response, I think that's definitely really helpful, is the willingness to spring in and defend journalists and people acting as journalists whenever this happens.
I think that's exactly right. I think maybe the training and the education needs to follow there being some real consequences when police do things like this, whether it's consequences in the court of public opinion, or whether it's, some big number settlements and damages awards. Once that happens, and once there is some real fear among police departments of the repercussions of retaliating against and targeting journalists, then maybe there's room to step in and say, let's train these officers on how they can avoid those situations. But we need to get to that point, and that's why we continue to publicize these sorts of situations, and why legal services organizations continue taking these kinds of cases pro bono, because it really only takes one or two headline grabbing cases to put this issue at the forefront of the sort of collective minds of police departments, and maybe shift their focus a bit and get them to take these issues seriously.
I appreciate both those answers. Thank you. My last question for the folks that are watching, um, how can they help? How can they help this situation, both yours specifically, but as well kind of in a broader sense? You mentioned consequences in the court of public opinion. Is there anything else FPF supporters, Asheville Blade supporters can do to help this situation?
I mean, I think two major ones are keep speaking up about this. The attention that's being brought to this has already, I think, at least made our journalists safer in the future. They're going to be a lot more hesitant to do this in the future. Do that everywhere. Like anytime something like this happens, especially I think for as trans non-binary journalists, the environment out there is getting dangerous on two fronts, both as journalists and as queer and trans people. So I think be willing to aggressively step in and support however that looks like in someone's local area, if you're at something happening in another area. And also bluntly, we operate in a shoestring budget. The Blade could use subscribers, we could use donations. And so any support on that front helps. This part of the point of attacks like this is to strain the resources of small organizations that don't have, lawyers and retainer or like a budget to be able to, two of our reporters are in court. Oh, we can just hire someone and bring them in. We don't have those kind of resources right now. So any support on that front is very welcome and much appreciated.
I think that covers a lot of what I have to say. The one thing I would add is make noise and make targeted noise. Social media has provided a lot of opportunities to call attention to these issues, and I'm not telling anyone not to retweet content and not to amplify content on social media. Everyone absolutely should, and that's really helpful. That makes everyone a publisher and gives everyone a platform. But I think sometimes people who back in the day might have called their elected representatives or written a letter to the DA or done some sort of direct outreach as a constituent, now are instead sort of screaming into the wind on Twitter. Do both, because you don't know who might read your tweet. So don't stop tweeting. But especially if you live in North Carolina, especially if you have, let's say, a connection to any of the elected officials or a connection to journalists who might want to cover the story, who might not want to be, who might not be aware of it. Do some direct outreach, get in touch with people who can help make a difference. Don't assume that, an organization like ours is already doing that. We're trying, we're covering every avenue we know, but there are always avenues we don't know. And, we're not from North Carolina. So my call to the DA only means so much. If the DA starts hearing from people who might have voted for him in the past and might not next time around, that really starts to make a difference.
Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your stories. I've been arrested a few times, and it is often just as hard to retell what happened as the event itself. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you all telling us how we can help and what we can do. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and you'll see this in the events archive once I get it edited. But thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.